the Birkenhead sank beneath the feet of men who knew it was doomed, but stayed anyway, inspiring a nation and artists alike. There were no more boats to launch, the shore was miles away, and most of them did not know how to swim. But still, they waited as the small boat full of women and children pulled away to safety. It gave a name to the act of allowing women and children to leave a sinking ship first. It would be known as the Birkenhead Drill.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the orderly death of the Birkenhead?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The HMS Birkenhead steamed forward at 8 knots, bringing fresh troops to the Cape Frontier War in South Africa. England was in the middle of the 8th and most costly of these wars, and this required a greater influx of troops. Continued disagreements between the British settlers and the native Xhosa had repeatedly erupted over territory. But this time, both sides seemed determined to put everything they could into the fight. The HMS Birkenhead was carrying drafts of men from 10 different regiments. Also on board were some of the officers' wives and children, though most of them had disembarked near Cape Town less than a day before. All was quiet at 2 in the morning of the 26th of February. Only the men of the watch stood on deck. It was a calm night with good weather as the ship drew near an outcrop known as Danger Point. The watch was attentive despite the good weather, and they scanned the ocean while the lead man called out, "Sounding 12 fathoms." Almost as soon as he said it, there was a horrifying sound as the HMS Birkenhead rammed into an uncharted rock. The HMS Birkenhead had originally been designed as a frigate, and named the Vulcan. This design and name was short-lived, however, and by the time that she was commissioned, she was named the Birkenhead after the town she was built in, and was remodeled into a troop ship. She was one of the first iron-hulled ships to be built for the Royal Navy, and with her steam engine that drove her twin paddle wheels, she could be considered a very modern ship when she was built. Her main fault was that she was not considered efficient enough to be a ship of war, but that did not stand in the way of a successful career as a troop transport. In January 1852, the Birkenhead left Portsmouth with some troops already on board, went to Southern Ireland to pick up more, and then began her journey towards South Africa. In total, she was carrying around 630 people on board after leaving her sick and many of the women and children when she docked to take on supplies in Simon's Bay near Cape Town. In accordance with his orders to make as much haste as possible, Captain Salmond charted a course that hugged the coastline of South Africa, trying to cut down on the time they would be at sea as much as possible. Though he did not order that the ship should travel at her maximum speed of 10 knots, she was not going to be accused of traveling slowly either. Having given his directions to the helmsman, Captain Salmond retired from the deck. As soon as she struck the rock, Captain Salmond rushed onto the deck and began to give orders. An experienced captain from a long line of men who had served as officers in the English Navy, Captain Salmond did what he thought was best for his ship and the men he had charge of. First, he ordered the bower anchor be dropped, and the quarter boats to be lowered for a fast evacuation if needed. His final order would be the one to receive later scrutiny. He ordered the ship engines to reverse. As the ship backed from the rock, water rushed in, and the ship hit the rock once again, making the wound on the ship much larger than before. The forward compartments of the ship were almost immediately filled with water, extinguishing the engine and drowning many of the sleeping soldiers in their hammocks, never knowing what had happened. Those who were able to rushed to the deck and took stock of the situation. The ship, having originally been built to be a warship, had watertight compartments, and so there were still portions below the deck where those who had been asleep awoke shocked, but not underwater. Lieutenant Colonel Seton was the senior officer on board, and as soon as he realized that the ship was in danger, he gathered the other military officers around him and instructed them to see to it that order and silence were kept among the men. To Captain Wright, the second highest military man on the ship, he gave the particular order: any orders given by Captain Salmond were to be done quickly and efficiently by the soldiers who had made it onto the deck. "60 of the soldiers were instructed to go man the pumps below deck, while 60 other soldiers were instructed to go lower the paddle box boats. Concern was mounting, however, about the strain that was being placed on the ship, and in the interest of trying to reduce the strain, the rest of the soldiers, as well as the women and children, were gathered on the poop. It would later be remarked that the soldiers remained calm, and there was no hint of the chaos that generally accompanied a sinking ship. The scene was lit by distress rockets that they fired off in the hopes of a rescue, but it was becoming increasingly clear that there was no one near to come to their aid. With this, all hope rested on the ship's boats. The ship's boats had their own series of misfortunes and misadventures, however. The deck of the ship starting to buckle meant that the pinnace at the center of the ship could not be accessed. The 2 paddlebox boats were the greatest hope to save the most people, since each of them carried 150. The port paddlebox boat was almost successfully launched, but the tackle broke, and as it fell, it took with it some of the soldiers who had been helping to launch it, and the men were drowned despite an attempted rescue. The starboard paddlebox boat was not even attempted, since the davits were rusted and it could not be released. A gig boat on the starboard side of the ship was being lowered when one of the ropes broke, and most of the men on her drowned as well. In total, only 3 of the ship's boats were launched successfully, with decay and a lack of maintenance being the primary factor in the loss of the use of the others. As they fought to launch any of the boats, the men found that they were now knee-deep in water, in between the ship's paddles, and the funnel came crashing down, crushing some of the men who were trying to free the starboard paddlebox boat still. At the same time, the ship's bowsprit broke away from the ship. Now, with recognition that there was no saving the ship, and that she was rapidly breaking up, Captain Salmond gave the order that the women and children on board, 21 in total, 8 women and 13 children, should be put into a boat to ensure their safety. At the same time, it was ordered that the 9 horses that were on board belonging to the officers should be driven overboard in the hopes that they would also survive. The horses had been spooked since the ship had first struck, but under the charge of Cornet Bond, the senior officer on board, they managed to drive all of the horses into the sea. Ensign Lucas of the 73rd was placed in charge of the gangway, and for the most part was able to ensure that women and children were the only ones who got on board the first cutter that was leaving the ship. Several men pushed past him and also got on board, but it did not change the fact that when the first cutter left the ship, only men remained on board the Birkenhead. It was reported that it was difficult to get some of the women on the boat, since it was already known that they would not likely see their husbands again, and it took a lot of persuasion for some of them to leave. Their husbands joined in the insistence that they should escape with the children. And finally, the cutter pulled away to a distance that would prevent it from being swamped by people trying to board it. The men who had been at the pumps had already drowned, though it is not certain when, and the water was gaining quickly on the ship as the remaining men on deck loaded the second cutter and the captain's gig with more soldiers and sailors. These boats were also finally forced to pull away, heavily laden. In total, about 80 people were able to escape from the ship in the boats. Finally, there were no more boats available to load, and the officers and their men gathered on the poop deck to await what would come. The stern by this time was high in the air, and Captain Salmond gave the order that he thought would save the most lives. He shouted that anyone who could swim should try to save themselves by jumping into the sea and heading towards the boats that had already pulled off. Lieutenant Colonel Sutton, however, immediately counteracted the order, seeing the danger of what might follow. There was too strong of a chance that a lot of panicked men swimming and clinging to the boats might sink the boat with the women and children, thus undoing the entire act of letting them leave the ship first. He voiced this concern to his men and begged them to not follow the captain's order, but to instead stand firm. To his voice was added the voice of Captain Wright and Lieutenant Girardot, also exhorting the men to not rush to follow the boats. A few men broke ranks and jumped into the sea despite this request, but most of the men, almost all untested new recruits, remained on the deck and allowed the boats to pull away towards the shore and safety. They would not have to wait long for the ship to force them into the sea. The ship finally broke in two, and the poop deck began to sink beneath the waves, plunging the men into the water. Ensign Lucas found himself standing next to Lieutenant Colonel Sutton, and the two shook hands, and Sutton told Lucas, who could swim, that he should jump into the water and go before the ship fully sank. Lucas told Sutton that he hoped to see him on shore, but Sutton did not seem optimistic and admitted that he did not swim. Already, the water was full of men struggling, and Ensign Lucas paused for a moment before finally taking the plunge. Meanwhile, the rigging of the ship was quickly becoming full of those who could not swim. In total, it had only been 20 minutes since the ship had first struck the rock, and now the stern of the ship was entirely submerged. The stories of heroism and the struggle to survive did not end with the ship sinking. The sea was treacherous in the area the Birkenhead had sank in, and a part of the ocean known as Shark Alley, due to the huge quantity of great white sharks that thrive there. Many of the men, especially the ones who went into the sea naked, became prey to the sharks. The men who managed to swim the 3 miles from the wreck to the shore were still not safe. When the men got close to the shore, a dense kelp forest off the shore was waiting to entangle them, and the already exhausted men were forced to fight through it while they swam, if they wanted to survive. Ensign Lucas found one of the paddle box boats still overturned as it had been stored on the ship, but floating on the waves. He joined a few other men laying on it, and they eventually reached the shore, though he said later that he wished that he could forget all of the images of death that he had seen in the ocean around him. He would reach the shore with the help of some of the men of his regiment, though his legs were cut up by the rocks and reefs, and he was one of the few officers to survive the wreck. Captain Wright was also among those who made it to shore. He used a broken section of the deck as a raft and helped to pull 14 other men out of the water. Lieutenant Girardot also made it to shore, as did the ship's surgeon, Dr. Bowen. Cornet Bond, the senior officer of the Lancers, also survived, having been the most prepared for a wreck out of any on board. Before setting out on the last voyage of the Birkenhead, Cornet Bond had personally purchased a Macintosh life preserver, making him the only person with a life preserver on the ship. He would reach the shore with its aid, and even be so lucky as to find that his horse was already on shore and safe. These 5 officers were the only officers to survive out of the 14 that had been on the ship the day before. Captain Salmond chose not to leave the ship, even though he was among the number on board who was able to swim. He remained on board the Birkenhead, giving orders and helping to maintain calm until the stern of the ship broke away and threw him into the water. He was struck with a piece of the deck in the back of the head while trying to swim to safety, and sank beneath the waves. Lieutenant Colonel Seton, who also remained on deck until the end, was dragged beneath the waves by other drowning men unable to swim. He never stood a chance of saving himself. To Ensign Russell goes the greatest note of sacrifice, however. He had been pulled out of the water by one of the ship's cutters, but saw another man nearby them who was clearly about to drown due to exhaustion. He asked that that man also be saved, but he was refused as it was feared that the boat was already too overloaded. Ensign Russell could not accept this, and traded places with the man in the water, allowing him to be pulled aboard. Moments later, Ensign Russell would be pulled beneath the waves by a shark and never seen again. Though the boats could be considered safer than the water or the beach, they were having difficulties of their own. They could not find a good place to land. The shore was too rocky, and the seas on the shoreline were too rough. They were forced to give up on the idea of landing, and instead try to find help. Though they all tried to stick together, they soon were separated, with one of the cutters pulling ahead due to having the most oars, while the cutter holding the women and children fell behind due to having the fewest people at the oars. The fastest of the cutters eventually fell in with the schooner Lioness, which saved them, and learning what had occurred, headed to the wreck. They would eventually also come to the second cutter, which had increased their speed by rigging one of the women's shawls as a sail. The gig, which was smaller than the 2 cutters, had fallen victim to the wind, and was blown away before the schooner could be reached. They eventually would reach Port d'Urban, 15 miles from the wreck. Leaving the ship's gig behind as collateral, Dr. Culhane, the assistant ship's surgeon, borrowed a horse and rode the 100 miles to Cape Town to try to get help. Almost 100 years later, the gig was still in use in Port d'Urban. At this point, Dr. Culhane gave a list of those who had made it to the boats, and said that he thought it likely they were the only survivors. But the only steamer in the port, the Rhadamanthus, was sent out all the same, with the hopes of rendering any aid. The Rhadamanthus soon fell in with the schooner Lioness, which not only had the people from the 2 cutters on board, but also about 40 men that they had been able to pull out of the rigging that was still above water of the Birkenhead. The Rhadamanthus towed the Lioness back to Cape Town, and went back to its search. Much of what it found, however, was death and destruction, in the form of bodies along the beach, and crates from the ship that had been smashed on the rocks. It was to the benefit of all that Captain Wright was familiar with the coast that they had wrecked on, and therefore he knew that about 6 miles away there was a fishing village, though it was a difficult walk through thick thorn-covered bushes. It took most of the day to reach it, but Captain Wright brought the men who he encountered on the beach there. Then, realizing the men had been without food all day, he personally walked another 8 miles to a farm where he could get provisions sent back to those who were in the fishing village. Ensign Lucas and the men of his regiment found them in the fishing village the next day. Lucas had suffered greatly. In their search for any sort of shelter or aid, he had been forced to walk through the same thorny brush that had impeded Captain Wright's party, but Lucas was only wearing a shirt and no pants, causing his legs to be so damaged that at one point he sat down saying he could not go on. He was only shamed into starting to walk again when the soldiers, rather than leaving him, started to carry him. Chiding himself for a lack of courage, he forced his legs to move again, but they were becoming more and more swollen. They had finally found a Dutch farmer who let them spend the night, fed them, and then guided them to the fishing village. Ensign Lucas offered the farmer his ring in exchange, but it was refused. It would not be the only kindness they would receive on those shores. He was brought to the farm of a former captain of the 7th Dragoons, a Captain Smales and his wife, and slowly nursed back to health. Captain Wright continued his trek across the beach in search of survivors, and at one point he even fell in with a group of seal hunters in a whaling boat who he convinced to join him in his search. In this way, he was able to save the lives of another 2 men, and unfortunately, bury many more bodies where they were found. The Rhadamanthus eventually found them in the fishing village and took them on board, bringing them to safety. In total, 194 of the 638 people on board survived the wreck. It was later said that the first sign that something had happened was not the surgeon's assistant arriving in Cape Town, but rather the horse belonging to one of the Lancers was standing outside of its old stable the next morning in Cape Town, when it should have been on the ship. Though the first use of the phrase women and children first is debated, the Birkenhead gave it a name, the Birkenhead Drill, later inspiring a stanza by Kipling. The moment that Ensign Russell was pulled beneath the waves by the shark after giving up his place in the boat was immortalized in art with a painting by Thomas M. Hemy, in a painting called The Wreck of the Birkenhead. Frederick William of Prussia ordered that an account of the wreck should be read to every one of his regiments, in the hopes that they would also stand fast, as the untested soldiers on the Birkenhead had done in a time of crisis. There would be a court-martial, as a ship of the Royal Navy had sunk, but there was little blame to be assigned, as anyone who could have received it was already dead. It was true that Captain Salmond had chosen to sail too close to a dangerous shore, and it was true that there was no senior officer on deck for the evening watch. But all of these details were brushed away by the incredible story of sacrifice and bravery that the survivors told the court. Order had not broken on the ship, even as she had sank beneath their feet. Their actions had turned a wreck that might have been a blemish on the service into a story of heroism that would be an inspiration for others to follow. For more information, please see A Deathless Story by A. C. Addison and W. Matthews, which includes many details about the court-martial and the lives of survivors after the wreck. Or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.